Welcome back to week 4 and module 4 of our study in Solitude. This week we're gonna focus on part 1 of spiritual disciplines of solitude, or of the spiritual discipline of solitude. And last week, of course, we studied on the science issues. Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines discipline as training or development by instruction and exercise, especially in self-control. This is in line with our working definition that we've been speaking of for the past couple weeks of spiritual discipline for the course. And that is, spiritual disciplines are repetitions of exercises and practices designed to develop and strengthen the spirit of a Christian and to help increase God's authority and lordship in a believer's life, all the while growing character and training the believer toward the goal of maturity in Christ. The spiritual discipline of solitude can be summed up by Dallas Willard, who said this: solitude and silence are the most radical of the spiritual disciplines because they most directly attack the sources of human misery and wrongdoing. To be in solitude is to choose to do nothing for extensive periods of time. All accomplishment is given up. Silence is required to complete solitude, for until we enter quietness, the world still lays hold of our hearts, of us. When we go into solitude and silence, we stop making demands on God. It is enough that God is God and we are His. Following the example of Old Testament prophets like Elijah and, of course, Jesus Christ in the New Testament, early Christians fled to the wilderness to escape persecution and draw closer to God. This week we want to speak about some of those folks in the 4th century who did escape and went to be with the Lord, and also went to, to bring discipline to their lives. Paul of Thebes and the early Christian hermits are among those people. St. Paul of Thebes, who was born around 227 and died somewhere around 342. He was regarded as the first Christian hermit. He fled into the Egyptian desert in around 250 during a great persecution, and he lived the rest of his well over 100 years of life in a cave near a brook and a palm tree. And as previously mentioned, early Christians followed Paul's example, Paul of Thebes' example, and began to move into the wilderness to escape persecution and to draw close to God. Another character named Anthony the Great, who was born in 251 and passed away in 356, met with St. Paul of Thebes in around 342. Anthony had spent 15 years in a tomb resisting the temptations and torments of the devil. Then he spent 20 more years in an abandoned desert fort to then organize and instruct other hermits to become known. One day, he became known as the father of all monks. You see, in those times, even probably today, hermits lived separately but came together on Sundays to worship. Anthony the Great inspired many to seek out the monastic life. And by the middle of the 4th century, asceticism was spreading. Asceticism, from the Greek word askeo, means to exercise or to train. It's the practice of and denial of physical or psychological desires in order to attain a spiritual ideal or goal. That's according to the Britannica Encyclopedia. Many of the early monks started as a gathering of hermits, a group that would later be housed in what we call now monasteries. And sewn into the life of early monks was a vow of celibacy, a vow of poverty, and obedience. Interestingly, the words monk and monastery come from the Greek word monos, which means alone. You know, we use the word mono, which means one. It means alone. The tradition of monasticism, over the centuries has become a staple primarily in the Catholic Church. Although some discipline is good, excessive discipline can be unhealthy. Critics have argued, says Dr. Neil Burton, that monasticism involves an unnatural degree of self-denial for which there is no biblical basis. My good friend Dr. Steve Lawson has said that every Christian is responsible to pursue holiness, yet God must work within us to produce personal godliness. Only God can produce authentic self-discipline in the believer. It was Paul who wrote in Philippians 2:13, "For it is God who is working in you, both to will and to work according to his good purpose." I pray that you have a wonderful week studying and seeking the Lord.